Welcome to the MBA series. This is a special multi-part series within Next Economy Now. We are going to review the arc of the learning journey that is presented in the Next Economy MBA online course. We are open sourcing the content from our course and hope to share it in this shorter, bite-sized format. We are launching this series because we were asked to do it by listeners like you. We're also doing it because we are writing a book entitled The Next Economy MBA, Redesigning Business for the Benefit of All Life, which will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Barrett Kohler Publishers. This is a sizable series. There will eventually be 18 podcast episodes of course content and 9 interviews with MBA alumni. We will be rotating every other week with our normal Next Economy Now interview format. We hope you enjoy it. Please reach out to us via our website, lifteconomy.com, with any comments, feedback, or requests. And now, on with the show.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Karla Brollier. Karla is one of my favorite people, and it feels like a total privilege to have her share some of her story on Next Economy Now. Karla is a catalyst in the climate and human rights movement in both the public and private sectors. She has spent much of her career consulting and working on emergent issues such as policy, economic models, environmental justice, and the like, and has worked with the Climate Reality Project, the UN, and directly with several US administrations and a multitude of international and nationally based climate change related programs and groups, such as for former VP Al Gore, the World Economic Forum. And Karla has given plenary presentations at the international level, including at the World Economic Forum, presented at the United Nations, lectured at multiple universities, as well as facilitated and taught workshops and classes really around the globe. Among other things, Karla is the founder and director of the Climate Justice Initiative, which focuses on Indigenous peoples, human rights, and climate change. She's also the founder and a senior consultant for Saghani Consulting, which is an emergent economy, social justice, and climate impact consulting firm. And if that weren't enough, Karla is also starting a next chapter, starting an impact investment fund that maybe we can hear some of the ideas behind that as we get into the discussion. And there's other things too. But pertinent to this series, Karla is also a graduate of the Next Economy MBA program. Of course, in addition to institutional education with an undergraduate degree and an MBA in Alaska, I always enjoyed Karla's questions during the Next Economy MBA that came up during the training, and her thoughtful and provocative sharing of information kind of from her lived experience and insights from her work with other program participants. I always learn something valuable from Karla and am absolutely delighted to have her on the program. Karla, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's such an honor to be here.
So, Karla, I'm wondering if you could start with kind of a little bit about, or whatever you want to share about your story. What brought you to the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. I guess the main thing we can start with is just my why. And why I've kind of just always focused on climate change is because I am from the Arctic, born and raised in an Indigenous community, and grew up in a very traditional lifestyle, understanding the deep connection of the environmental world and the relation to things around climate change. And that's just kind of the way I've shaped my entire career to this point, is addressing the nexus of climate change, Indigenous rights, and working on things around economic mobility and everything in that space. Since everything is so deeply interconnected, it's been a very interesting journey of always trying to find more of the systemic reasons why some of these issues are happening, or find out how we can actually make some changes in these spaces that everybody's always trying to look at in really complex ways. But overall, I think it was mostly just because this is the way that I was raised, of understanding and appreciating the nature that I live in and the world that I live in, and also seeing the impacts of climate change every single day in the communities that I grew up in the Arctic. I guess you would just say it's melting really fast in the Arctic. So it's a very visible change that's happening, much more than like an abstract change that some people might be seeing in other places. But my why is because it's just so deeply connected to the core of who I am, of addressing one of the largest issues and trying to protect our culture at the same time around that. It's very complex, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how you always hold kind of the systems and interactions and interdependencies of different aspects of any problem, but from your lived experience, a deep why, the visceral experience of climate change in your community with your family and your relatives. So that's brought you to a number of different kind of vocational pathways. And maybe you want to go over and share some of what you're doing, say, for example, with the Climate Justice Alliance. What would you say about that would be interesting for listeners to know about?
Yeah, this organization was founded back in maybe, I think, 2017 or 2018. And the reason it was created was because I was doing a lot of work on an international level and then also more of a national level with policymakers and the like. And there's always a space in there of asking for Indigenous representation or people that were actually had lived experiences to be the ones to help shift some of the ways that we are looking at some of these issues. And in these spaces, there wasn't enough actual representation of people at the table that had any of the lived, learned, and educated experience all collectively. So founded the Climate Justice Initiative and have a board of fully Indigenous women who are absolutely amazing. And in this, it's just kind of evolved into being one of the first, if not the first, climate change and climate justice organization that focuses on Indigenous people that's also led by Indigenous people in the US. So it's been an evolution of trying to figure out how it needs to exist in the world and what its genuine purpose is and how it can show up best for the communities. And everything was kind of complicated in the space of COVID as well. So not being able to actually work inside of some of the communities alongside any of the elders that would tell stories or anything like that. So it's just been an evolving organization that hasn't really had a roadmap to move off of or base any of its work from. So it's been trying to adjust to the changing climate as well as the political environments and everything of the sort. So it's been a very interesting ride for sure.
And how did you assemble the initiative? Did you go meet with people that you already knew, or how did it all come together? I'm just kind of curious with some of that backstory.
Yeah, there is so many amazing people already doing a lot of this work, especially in Alaska, where all of the board is. And so all of these people that are already doing all of this amazing work were doing it voluntarily, or maybe they weren't like saying that they were a part of an organization or anything like that. So it was just part of communities that I already knew of people that were doing climate change related work or Indigenous rights kind of work already, just in different spaces. So it was just tapping into a community that was already there and that was already involved. And so with that, knowing that developing a legal structure like a 501c3 is a pretty complicated process. So it's not that every single group should assemble a 501c3 to do this work, but in this particular case, it did make a lot of sense to do that.
Yeah, so it could be unincorporated associations or just work connecting people, but in this case, actually founding a 501c3 was the best way to move the Climate Justice Initiative forward as an entity. That's not the only entity that you founded. You want to say something about Saghani Consulting and kind of how that came together and what some of the kind of and types of work that you do there?
Yeah, so this one's a very fun project that I've been working on also. So with the consulting firm, it just works mostly around things like economic models, but it also holds like this baseline of always working towards Indigenous people or any kind of way that we could make sure that we are the ones determining our future in all of these spaces. So if it's working in like a space with helping maybe people develop a fundraising model where they wanted to give to Indigenous communities, but they didn't know how, that's when we could help figure out what ways they need to actually communicate or how they can create some of the committee members, all of these things to make sure that there's like true representation of the people that's going to be serving those people. And then it does other different areas of working around policy as well. So we do some work in things like if there's any kind of issues on a tribal land where people are maybe doing work to maybe have an extraction process to make sure that there's adequate conversations with any of the tribal communities that represent that area, since all of the communities are so different and have all of these different social norms and cultural rules and things like that. So it's not that every tribal community is all of the same. So it's understanding that and working with each one of them in different ways to make sure that their cultural rights are respected, their economic rights are taken care of, and everything in between that too. So at the consulting firm, there's just a lot of different projects that we work on that are very fun. And some of them are not so fun, but it kind of varies. Like some of them are very challenging for sure, in a way of when you're working on climate change, it's not always the easiest thing to figure out how to find the silver lining in some of these projects, but some of them you actually know you're making a really big difference. And that's what kind of keeps some of these projects going.
I love how you've shared that before with me. It's always made a profound impact that sometimes in the rhetoric around First Nations or Indigenous peoples, there's this kind of almost assumption, especially from more ignorant white communities, that like, oh, the Indigenous is just a monolith, but you're raising that there's diversity within communities, but always maintaining self-determination, embracing the fact that there is a diversity of perspectives within different tribal communities in terms of their projects, their approaches, and what they want. But part of your work is always grounded in supporting an authentic, self-determined approach. And I find that to be profound and powerful. And you're able to navigate the nuance there with grace, even when the projects, maybe some of them aren't as fun as others.
Yeah, it's definitely threading a needle of making sure that we are working with sovereign nations that are very unique and very specific in their own ways. And then also making sure that we are looking towards the future and determining how all of these individual communities want to imagine their future and what they actually want out of this. Like if they want to create some economic models, or if they want to, protect environmental spaces, whatever it is that they want to determine in the future is completely up to them. So it is definitely trying to thread that needle of working in Indigenous culture, and then also working alongside the Western culture and making sure that both on like the scientific side of Indigenous knowledge and then Western science is both respected as equals in all of these spaces. And then creating more things of like economic mobility for communities that haven't really been a part of some of the movements lately.
Right. Is there a particular project that comes to mind that you would want to share some of the details of, or enough detail to give a kind of a flavor? I know they're very diverse types of projects, but either on policy or an economic model, is there something that a story that might come to mind that you would share from that work?
Yeah, of course. So there's a project back where I'm from in Alaska, where it's kind of interwoven in a lot of ways, but we are working with a lot of different entities to create a report that's basically a report that addresses some of the unmet needs in Alaska. And so that means what actually needs to be developed on an infrastructure level and an economic level to make sure these communities are going to be adapting to climate change, but on their own terms. So what that means is right now we have about 10 communities that are determined to be the most environmentally threatened, meaning they might be having permafrost melt or losing fresh water or anything where the environment is shifting so rapidly that they have to quickly determine what they're going to be doing with their communities and how they're going to pay for this. And so with this project that we're currently working on, trying to determine what each one of these specific communities want to do, and then also how much it's going to cost to be able to do that. And we're trying to do this now because if we wait every single year, it would just get more exponentially expensive. And then it would be some issue like FEMA that would have to cover it. And that would cost maybe like 10 times more every single year we wait than it would if we would just address it in the first place. So with this right now, we're at about 80 million per year to be addressing some of these communities. And that's kind of on a conservative side. So with that 80 million per year, that would help all of these communities either move or manage in place or whatever it is that they choose to do. So with that, we're trying to figure out how to get some of the funding and all of that goes along with it. So it's, as you can imagine, very complex, a lot of moving pieces, but it's definitely important to make sure that we create the space for the autonomy for the communities in the Arctic. That's where in the Arctic, it's just melting so much faster than anybody ever anticipated. So we didn't really have that time that all the scientists thought we had. So it's definitely an imperative.
Yeah. It seems like there's so many different tensions, right? There's current unmet needs, and yet in the context of adaptation or retreat or management, there's different choices for the future that can ideally address needs. And those are, there's an anticipatory aspect to it, but then also grounded in authentic autonomy and sovereignty. And of course, that moves at the speed of trust. And sometimes we would assume that moves slow, but that's where I think you and your consulting allies that you bring into projects, what I've heard from you before is you're able, because authentically you have a lived experience, at least in Alaska with community there, that you can actually establish or build rapport and trust in a way that actually it's still going at the speed of trust, but it might move faster than other trust building, or maybe I'm guessing at that. But either way, trust is important.
Yeah, no, you're pretty accurate on that. That's exactly right. So there's a lot of issues, especially in communities like in Alaska or other tribal communities where the historic trust there is obviously not there for all the different reasons. But building that with other communities and then building that relationship with entities that have already existed in Alaska that have done this kind of work for a really long time, and then other people that have these certain skill sets that we can bring in that also have lived experiences is kind of like this perfect combination of ways that we're trying to address some of these issues. It is very, very complex and a lot of moving pieces. And when you ever work with sovereign nations in these spaces, but still within the United States, it definitely adds another layer of complexity. And then there's the cultural piece on top of it, and then the economic piece.
When you look at the economic piece in terms of the cost of taking some of the necessary actions, you do get to some large sums in there, but they're also small in comparison. Never would be able to account for the historic injustice and harm. And these sums also go into different types of projects and models. Can you talk a little bit about the share fund and kind of the size? I was impressed with the share fund as a project separate to the initiative, climate justice initiative, and your consulting. But when you told me about what you were doing with the share fund, I was really impressed and grateful to you for kind of managing such prodigious amounts of resource to do what's needed. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just a first caveat, no person is an island in any one of these spaces. So there would be no way that I could work on any of these projects without building a community around me. And then also working with people that I deeply respect and deeply admire in so many ways. And with the share fund, that's sort of how how my involvement came to it anyway, is there were some folks that wanted to give back to the world. And so with this, they wanted to give all of their funding, their entire life savings to creating a philanthropy fund, but didn't know where to start or didn't know what to do. So then that's when we all created this share fund. And with this, it's basically, I guess the best way to put it in current philanthropy terms would be a trust-based model. And so with the share fund, we pulled together a group of folks that are all people that have lived experiences in different areas, but also sort of, I guess you could say, walk in two worlds of they have both experiences of the Western world and then their actual heritage of where they're from. So in that way, we had a pretty good understanding of some of the actual issues in all of these communities to be able to create this. And so we had a group of people, and then we pulled together some community recommendations for who we wanted to fund. And so then it kind of started with a small pool of folks where we decided on who we wanted to fund based on a lot of different factors around wanting to make sure that it was led by a person of color, ideally a woman. And then they were addressing issues around social inequality or climate change or anything around that. So then with those parameters, we created this model where we pulled all of these groups together and then decided how to split up the funding through them. And then once we pulled all the people together, then we just told them how much they were getting and all of that. So there's no application process. There's no check-ins. There's really nothing. It's just 100% trust-based, based on community reputation. And then it just kind of rolls out from there. So it just kind of continues to create a model where everybody is continuously deciding who the next community recommended group would be. And then they just continue to fund out from that. And then it sounds like the fund is going to continue to grow larger, since it was initially just one family, and then rolling more families into it that actually really love the model of having the people that are from the communities fund the communities that need any kind of support in any kind of way. And also being notable that it's not a classic philanthropy fund in the way of, it doesn't need to be a 501c3. It could be anybody. It could be an individual. It could be a business. It could be a B Corp. It really doesn't matter, as long as they're doing really good work and the community says that they're doing amazing things and they have a great reputation, and all of that's basically all that matters outside those particular parameters I already mentioned. So it's just a way to try to work outside some of the classic inherent barriers that come with things like 501c3s and philanthropy. Because I mean, being a person that started a 501c3, it's very challenging to fundraise. It was probably one of the hardest things I think I've done, was fundraising for 501c3. And that shouldn't be the case. But it was more of like emotionally taxing in a lot of ways than it was paperwork hard, if that makes sense. So it was in a way of, people are always, all the fundraising that I've done before were kind of like asking about some of the issues that they were directly going to save. If they were going to be funding an Indigenous-led group, they wanted to know what some of the trauma stories were, and then they wanted to know exactly how they were going to be able to fix it so they could get pat on the back or whatever they were going to do. And so with this, it was more of like, we didn't really want to expose people to anything like that, but also wanted to shelter people from doing that. And so it was a way of teaching other people in philanthropy how to try to do it better. Because I mean, what would people even do with some of these reports anyway, besides put them in a shelf? So we don't really need the impact reports, and really didn't need to ask people to explain like their hardest things they've had to go through in order to fund them. So just kind of got rid of all that, and then try to figure out what people need and how we can create the most amount of impact and what that would look like. And it just came down to, you just give people money. And it was actually a lot easier than we thought it was going to be. So you just give people money, and then they do the amazing things they're going to do. And you just trust that they're going to do it. And they do.
I didn't even think about that aspect of the kind of the re-traumatizing portion of these applications and the specifications that a traditional, conventional command and control philanthropy has as their like tropes and patterns. And how, like you're saying, how emotionally taxing that is for communities to, not just once, but time and time again, in terms of accessing resources to address community needs, to write that out and then report back, and how that creates barriers to needs actually being met, but actually also perpetuates harm, which is very insightful. And this trust-based or participatory kind of approach of having the community be able to select who receives funding, and then the funding goes. Can you share, I remember you telling me one time how large the share fund is, and it sounds like it's growing a little bit, but in just rough and broad strokes, how much are we talking about here in terms of resources to communities?
Yeah, so right now it's in a bit of an evolution. So the first year was just an experiment. Is this going to work? Are we going to need to tweak this? All of that. And so right now we're in conversations about what it's actually going to look like. And so in some of that, it has been shifting. So I think it's going to be exponentially growing every year, but so far it's about 600,000 per year. And those, some of them are going to be moving towards multi-year grants, so to speak. And so it's going to be funding people maybe like 50,000 for each entity for X amount of years, depending on whatever the committee decides that's going to be. So it's just going to be kind of more of like decided on by the committee at large. And so far it's been working really well. So we didn't have to do a lot of tweaks, just figuring out how to better show up for some of the communities that have been really excited about it. So I think maybe one small example of something we did get rid of is we had a small grant that was like, oh goodness, I can't remember how much it was. I think it was $15,000, but it was like a side thing that was not a part of the actual grant. It was just like everybody had a really hard year for the last couple of years. So this grant was specifically designed for people to take care of themselves in whatever way they wanted to. So it could be just, ED would just cut checks to everybody, or they would do a spa day, whatever. But we also never really checked in. So, but I think just the really funny part about that too is I think that is the only one where people wanted to tell us how they all spent that funding. So, and I don't know why. It was a really interesting small social experiment in that way of they just all were telling us exactly what they spent all of that extra funding on without being asked at all. So yeah, all that to be said is just decided to put that funding back into the larger pool just so that everybody could have all of the funding and they could just do whatever they want with it, general overhead, whatever.
Wonderful. Great example and great story about like the voluntary reporting that comes from the trust, or at least in that case, which is interesting. And then the scaling up. So 600,000 becomes over a period of years, millions, and potentially tens of millions over time. Again, not adequate to the need by itself, but that's why you have the Climate Justice Initiative, your consulting, and some of the other projects. That leads me to be a little bit curious, and I know it's not launched, and so I'm not sure how much you can say, but there's another chapter that's opening up for you around Impact Investment Fund. Can you share a little bit about, and again, if there's, we don't need the details on this podcast, but it'd be great if you could at least give us a hint.
Yeah, of course. So I'm very excited about the next chapter of where this journey is going to be taking me. And it looks like it's going to be a lot more towards more on the private sector. And I guess maybe just as like a little bit of a caveat in that, everything I have done is under the climate change umbrella. So every single project I've ever worked on or anything I've done has always been in a lens of how to address climate change and also address it with an Indigenous rights perspective. So that's kind of just how I've filtered everything so far. And with that, I've been looking into much more of the impact investing side in collaboration, joining another pre-existing fund where they're going to add another chapter that's going to be just for climate change related investments. And so with this, adding some of the attempt to address the private sector side, given that this is how you create a lot of jobs and how you can actually create economic mobility. And I know the world of impact investing can be very nuanced and challenging to kind of get a grasp on for some folks. And so figuring out exactly what the specifics are that we want to invest in and figure out everything between that of what it's going to look like, what the needs are, what the impact could be, and all of that in between. So it's going to be a very interesting chapter. And I think one of the largest parts that really excite me about it is knowing that there aren't, well, let me rephrase that, maybe not exciting, but something that I guess just really makes me passionate to be able to do this because it's such a deep need, is there aren't any other Indigenous focused VC or impact funds that are working on some of these climate change related issues, and knowing that there is just a complete lack of any kind of funding for Indigenous women to be able to invest in companies like this is something that really needs to be addressed. And I guess maybe to that point, why this is so important is because Indigenous people know climate change, and they also inherently know a lot of the solutions to it too. So moving just outside of like the classic philanthropy space to be able to address some of these larger issues is moving more into the private sector space where we can actually invest in all of these people that deeply understand the issue and also inherently understand the solutions too. So this is a space that I really hope that we can start creating a little bit more awareness in and funding in, and then also just open this up too, since it's not, so it wouldn't be such like an exclusive community because it shouldn't be like VC is literally impossible to get into unless you like know somebody or anything like that. And so people like myself that come from the Arctic that don't have all of these deep relationships with high net worth individuals or LPs or anything like that, It's literally impossible to be able to have other people that deeply understand these issues be able to have ways to fund these issues or collaborate or build up other entrepreneurs that actually see some of the systemic issues, have ideas how to fix it, but just have no access to resources. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the ways that I really hope that we can catalyze this next step.
Thank you for that work, Karla, and for the courage to step into those spaces and both model and create more access. And also, direct funds where it's needed. I'm reminded that most of the venture private equity VC around a climate thesis is oriented around market rate return, climate tech. And that's the things that, First Nations and Indigenous peoples know intimately, the natural environment, nature-based solutions that are both adaptive as well as mitigating further harm, and true solutions are resolving true community issues, whether it's around food security or strategic retreat or waste management or diversified renewable energy or all those things, which could involve tech, sure, but it doesn't have to be just siloed around some type of romanticized Silicon Valley climate tech model, which such a preponderance of the funding tends to go towards because there's no representation and no access. And I really appreciate you for, again, the courage of stepping into those spaces.
Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting space to work in, just knowing the lack of access to funding, both on the philanthropy side and the VC side. So any way that we can start moving some of the resources to the folks that have been historically excluded from access, but also people that do understand what circular economy means, but just in a different term or in a different way of existing in it. So just ways that we can start shifting some of the funding where it needs to go. So it's not just still in the same cycle of what kind of caused some of these issues in the first place.
Most definitely. What are some of in thinking of, so many challenges, so many opportunities, what are some of the things that kind of keep you up at night? And I can guess some of the things that probably are keeping me up at night as well. But I'm curious what, at this moment now, as we're recording this in the late summer, coming into fall in 2022, what are some of the things that are really on your mind?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say, climate change is a pretty big one, knowing that it's a really interesting space to hold this nexus of understanding that the entire world that you grow up in and where your whole family still is shifting, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And so that's a really challenging piece to hold. But at the same time, understanding that climate change is going to be a thing where we are trying to address it and everybody's starting to get aware of it. And so that's on the other side, helping a lot better, but also trying to make sure that we have representation for cultures that have been left out of the conversation up until now. And knowing these things of that there's 5% of the world is Indigenous people, but they use and manage about a quarter of the Earth's surface and protect 80% of the global biodiversity, but they get 2% of the philanthropy funding and basically none of the VC or any kind of other funding in there. And just making sure that we kind of merge all of these worlds is something I've been thinking about for a very long time and haven't really totally figured out exactly how to do it. But just knowing that we need to figure out ways that we can bolster Indigenous peoples to be able to manage some of these lands, knowing that it shows less species decline, less pollution, and natural resources that are much better managed by people that have lived there for forever. So ways to just start shifting some of these models is ways that I try to think about both on a policy level and economic level, and maybe even restructuring tax models someday. Who knows?
For sure. I appreciate the big picture, longitudinal thinking, as well as there's immediate stuff to work on now. The intersectional kind of systems approach of knowing that the lifeways of Indigenous people are supportive of a thriving or flourishing biodiversity while meeting needs in place for long periods of time with a constant adaptation, even to rising seas. There are Indigenous peoples in place who have been in place since the last glacial maximum, 10,000 years ago, even in Alaska and other coastal communities. So things like sea level rise are not new to so many communities. And yet those communities who have that knowledge and the wisdom embedded into their lifeways are excluded from the resources that are currently now being directed and will increasingly be directed towards climate as a theme, the injustice. I see the why so strong, Karla, and you're starting the Climate Justice Initiative and all the work that you've done, because it is a criminal injustice in terms of the lack of resourcing those who have the lived wisdom and the experience to resolve the dilemma that's facing humanity with our exploitation lifeways towards more of a circular, like you said, whatever it's called. Who cares about the semantics? And it's going to be called different things by different communities, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I love how you always do the systems and the big picture work and the immediate work. Are there ways that Next Economy Now listeners can support your work in any way, or things that you would want their attention on?
Yeah, I would say maybe focusing on ways that folks could create more equality in things that they do. So, for example, it could be focusing on equal pay to help address some of the historic inequalities that are there. Because right now, if we compare even men and women, or on a larger continuum, you could have like a white male and an Indigenous woman, and the pay gap between that is about 50 cents per dollar. And so that would amount to about $25,000 per year if they both had the same education and the same background, and then they both worked the same job. They always get paid less. So ways that we could start addressing some of this, because that would compound to about $900,000 over a lifetime of loss for just no reason. So ways that we can address this is making sure that we create laws around putting how much jobs pay on it, or different things like that. So just always being hyper aware of those small nuances of not knowing when those spaces are inherent privileges of people just assuming but not understanding. So just in those types of spaces, just holding that space and awareness around knowing that there are other experiences and there are ways we can actually start addressing them. And so for right now, if we look at things of like, or even philanthropic funding. So if anybody's working in a space of being able to fund people, making sure that funding women and funding Indigenous groups are one of the tenets of it. So, and even that wouldn't even address it, with less than 2% going to Indigenous groups. And of that, 2% are going to Native women-led groups, which is way too small. That should not be the case. It's starting to change, but all of these things of just starting to move some of the resources is all we can really do in that space. So small details of making sure you pay equally, or
start where you're at, so that everybody's in some position, and whatever your positionality, there's things that you could do today. And then also, I love how you always bring in a lens that there is policy work to be done. And so many people leave that off because there's so much stagnation and frustration around the mechanisms of regulation and governance. And I think maybe your skill and experience in navigating the nuances of working with sovereign nations and the intersections with nation states like the United States, and where policy comes to play, not to mention, of course, broken treaties and other aspects of legacy policy, but where new policy can happen, I love that you're not afraid to bring in, hey, you can take action now, and we can organize to influence policy as well, and that's actually going to be necessary.
Yeah. I mean, that's also a really important thing to hold too, though, is it's all necessary. So, I mean, globally, it's a very different world than if we look at the US or even Alaska. So making sure that like wherever this is, that there's like all of these different barriers between social, legal, or cultural norms that prohibit any kind of space to be able to start addressing these issues on people's own rights, like land access or anything like that. So always holding like more of a nuanced, lightly held, but firm kind of way of approaching some of these issues, and understanding how climate change impacts different people is also another piece that I try to always hold in a nuanced space too. So, it could be just something where the price of a certain nut that you enjoy gets higher, and that's about the only impact that you'll see, whereas other people are losing their entire culture and community. And so greater impacts of climate change are different for different sections of the population. And it's going to be the most vulnerable, whether it's in a developed country or a developing country. It is going to exacerbate those inequalities, usually on a gender lens and then also an economic lens at the same time. So it's usually going to be women that face the higher risks of burden and things like that from situations of poverty or roles, cultural norms, all of these different things. So that's kind of been hoping that we would work on more targeted investments in gender equality and women empowerment, but also making sure that we're doing it under the lens of climate change and Indigenous rights. So it kind of has a multi-tiered approach to it.
Well, I will make sure that in the show notes that when people listen to this, that they can access information about the Climate Justice Initiative and Saghani Consulting, as well as the Share Fund. Is there any other resources that you want to share where people can learn more about your work, or other resources you want to highlight and make sure that listeners are aware of?
Oh, there's so many amazing groups doing so much amazing work out there. It's so hard to pick just one of them. It depends if it's going to be more of like an economic group or, there's just so many. Honestly, wish we could just kind of fund all of them or help develop, like entrepreneurs in different spaces. But all that to be said is I think that's a great starting point. And I'm always happy to chat with people if anybody ever really wants to kind of dig a little bit more into things of like the international level or the human rights framework side of it, or any of those things around Indigenous self-determination or what developing new economic models looks like, or any space in there. I'm always open to any kind of conversation in that area too.
Thank you, Karla. Extraordinarily generous. And I learned something in this conversation, like I always learn from you. And thank you for everything that you do, everything that you're doing. I am so excited for your next chapter. And, thank you for your participation in the Next Economy MBA. It's such a benefit to the alumni community and everybody who was a participant along with you. And I'm just so grateful that you took a moment to share a bit of your story. And there's so much more I know we could talk about. And so maybe we'll do this again sometime. Is there any last words you want to leave the Next Economy Now listeners with?
No, it was just such an honor. And thank you. The Next Economy Now MBA program is a wonderful community. And it was a really, really great resource to have. So I definitely highly recommend that program to anybody that might be listening as well. So I appreciate you and the team and all the work you're doing.
Thanks, Karla.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.